Hey everyone, it's me, Josh. Welcome to Story Time. Today we're going to be reading Mr. Nonsense by Roger Hargreaves. Get comfortable, get ready wherever you are, because we're about to delve into story time. That's right. Let's find out what Mr. Nonsense is about. I feel like this might be fun. Mr. Nonsense had no sense at all. Not a scrap. I mean, he lived in a tree. A tree! Can you imagine? It's kind of like a tree house. And I know Mr. Impossible has a similar house in a tree. "Why do you live in a tree?" Mr. Happy asked him one day. "Because," replied Mr. Nonsense, "I tried living on the ground, but that was too high up. So I moved to a tree, to be nearer to the ground." "What nonsense," snorted Mr. Happy. "Thank you," replied Mr. Nonsense. I'm having a little chat there. And do you know what Mr. Nonsense liked to eat? Porridge. Nothing wrong with that, you might say. But porridge on toast? Really? "Why do you like porridge on toast?" Mr. Nosy asked him one day. "Because," replied Mr. Nonsense, "I tried porridge sandwiches and I didn't like them." Porridge sandwich would be interesting. And do you know where Mr. Nonsense sleeps? Every night? In a rowing boat. In his bedroom, in his house, up a tree. I don't know about you, but that looks kind of cool. Having a little rowboat as a bed. "Why do you sleep in a rowing boat?" Mr. Strong asked him one day. "Because," replied Mr. Nonsense, "I tried sleeping in a motorboat, but it was somewhat uncomfortable." Mr. Nonsense lives, as you might very well expect, in a country called Nonsense Land. Now I know somebody else who lives in Nonsense Land. Do you? Do you think it might be Mr. Silly? Let's find out. That's right, Mr. Silly. There you go. Perfect combination, Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense. Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense were close friends and saw a lot of each other. Mr. Nonsense was often round at Mr. Silly's house playing jigsaw puzzles. They used to throw the pieces at each other. How silly. And Mr. Silly was often round at Mr. Nonsense's house playing cards. They used to tear them up to see who could get the most pieces out of one card. What nonsense. That's not really doing jigsaw puzzles or playing cards at all. But I guess in their own way it is. However, this story is about the time it snowed in Nonsense Land. It didn't very often snow, but one winter it did. Now tell me, what colour is snow? White, that's right. But no. In Nonsense Land, when it snows, it doesn't snow white snow. It snows yellow snow. Don't ask me why, but it does. Yellow snow. Interesting. When Mr. Silly woke up one morning, the whole of Nonsense Land was covered. "I say," he said when he looked out of his bedroom window, "snow." And he was so excited he rushed round to Mr. Nonsense's house. Got all that yellow snow, everyone. Mr. Nonsense was asleep in his boat. "Wake up," cried Mr. Silly. "Wake up and come out and look out the window." "Whatever on earth is it?" grumbled Mr. Nonsense, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes as he got up and went across his bedroom to his bedroom window. Having a peep out. "I say," he said, looking out, "custard!" "That isn't custard, you silly banana," cried Mr. Silly. "That's snow." He rushed downstairs. "Come on," he called. And that day Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense had one of the very best days of their lives. They had a snowball fight. Mr. Silly's snowballs were round. Mr. Nonsense made snowballs that somehow or other came out sort of square. Check out the square snowballs Mr. Nonsense can make. Funny. They built a snowman, a very silly, nonsensical sort of snowman. Does look a little bit silly, doesn't it? Yeah. "Come on," said Mr. Nonsense that afternoon. "Let's go tobogganing." "But we don't have a toboggan," said Mr. Silly. "Oh, no, we don't," agreed Mr. Nonsense. Mr. Silly thought. "Oh, yes, we do," he cried. What do you think they used? The rowboat from Mr. Nonsense's house? Yeah. And Mr. Silly ran back to Mr. Nonsense's house and came back with his bed. Whee! They shouted together as they slid faster and faster down the hill in their rowing boat toboggan. Now for those of you that might be in places where it doesn't snow, you still can toboggan on grass and stuff like that. On hills. I'm from a place where it doesn't actually snow. Sunshine Coast in Australia. It was a wonderful day, and that evening, after having supper together, porridge pie, Mr. Nonsense suggested that they played a game. What should we play? Asked Mr. Silly. Drafts, suggested Mr. Nonsense. I've forgotten how to play drafts, said Mr. Silly. Oh, it's easy, replied Mr. Nonsense, and went round, opened all the doors and windows. There we are, he said. Drafts. What nonsense. There's a game you can play, drafts, but it's spelt differently to wind drafts. So, talking about drafts of wind, that's why he opened up all the windows and the doors. Nonsense. Thank you so much for reading Mr. Nonsense today. Hope you enjoyed the story. I'll be back with another story really soon. My name is Josh. This is Story Time. Bye for now. I'm not forever.